Hello, Chris P. Williams here. I hope you're well. I've got a tutorial for you today on the develop persona within Affinity Photo. And please ignore this photograph of my eye. It's something I knocked up this morning on an iPhone to try and demonstrate red eye removal, which we'll look at a little bit later on. So we're just going to go to File now to import a raw image. So I'm going to File, Open, and I'm going to select this raw image here of the flower. And you see when you load up a raw image, it automatically gets taken into the develop persona. If it was a JPEG, for instance, it would have been taken automatically into the photo persona. When you're in the develop persona, you can see the layout is very similar to the photo persona, but you'll notice on the left you have less tools to play with, and on the right there seems to be less happening on the palette front as well. So I'll explain to you a little bit about these tools. Right, the first tool on the left is the hand tool, and the shortcut for that is H. And if I zoom in on this image using my scroll wheel and I drag, you can see how the hand tool works. It just lets you navigate your image a little bit more precisely. So I'm just going to press Ctrl and 0 to zoom out, and we'll go on to the zoom tool. And the zoom tool does the same as what you can do with the scroll wheel, providing you set it up correctly in your preferences. And you can do that simply by pressing Edit, Preferences and Tools, and use mouse wheel to zoom. So I just close that, and the zoom tool does the same thing. Left clicking will zoom in, pressing Alt and left click will zoom out. Okay, I'm just going to press Command and 0 again to center my image, and we'll move on to the red eye removal tool. Now obviously there's no eyes in this image, hence the awful picture I took this morning of me. We'll switch to that, and what I'll do is I'll just click on the red eye removal tool, and it is simply a case of left clicking on the outside of the eye, dragging, and Affinity Photo gets rid of the red eye for you, and that is the sole purpose of that tool. So I'll return now to our flower image, and this is the image we're going to use for the rest of the demonstration. So the next tool down then is the blemish removal tool. Now to demonstrate this, I'm just going to scroll in on this flower, and we can see that there's a few blemishes on the white leaves, and I'll click on my blemish removal tool, zoom in slightly more, and I'm just going to hover my mouse over this first blemish here, and I'm going to reduce my brush size, and to do that it's simply a case of pressing the left square bracket. And then once I'm happy with the brush size, I can left click on the blemish. Whilst keeping my finger pressed on the left mouse button, I'm going to drag to another area of my image which I want to copy from and let go. And you can see the blemish is now gone. And I'll do that again now with this smaller blemish here. I'll reduce my brush size using the left square bracket, left click, drag, and let go. And I'll do it one more time, left click, drag, and let go. And that gives you the idea. But I'll try and get rid of this slightly larger blemish here, increasing my brush size this time by using the right square bracket, and I'll left click and drag to this area of red and let go. And I think that's done a pretty good job. So I'm just going to press Ctrl and 0 now to return to my full size image, and we're going to move on to the next tool, which is the overlay paint tool. The overlay paint tool is used to make adjustments to particular parts of your image. So for instance, in this case I want to work on this leaf in the bottom left corner of my image, and to do this I'm just going to go to my brush size, and I'm going to increase that slightly and click on my image, and you can see now that I can paint a mask over this area where we find the leaf. Now I can see I've overdone things on the edge there, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to my erase overlay tool, and I'm just going to drag down that edge and just take the edge off that selection. Once I'm happy, I can start making adjustments to my image, but these adjustments now are only going to affect where I painted the mask. Now before I do that, I'm going to switch to the overlays tab, and you can see here we have two layers now. One is the master, and that is the entire image, and the second is the brush overlay that we've just created. So we can now return to our basic adjustments, and what I'll do is I'll drop the exposure down on that leaf, and you can see the exposure is dropping, but it's only dropping in the area where we painted the mask. And likewise I can go down and increase the saturation, and again it's only affecting the area where we painted the mask. So you can see the overlay paint tool can be very useful. I'll return to the overlays now, and I'll click on the brush overlay, making sure that it's highlighted in blue, and I'll go to the bin, and that's how you remove the overlay. And if you wanted to create another overlay, then it's simply a case of either clicking on the overlay paint tool, or you can select the overlay paint tool from the overlays palette. We'll now move on to the gradient overlay tool, and again you can access the gradient overlay tool from the palette, or you can access it from the toolbar. And basically what the gradient overlay does is, if you left click on the outside edge of your image and drag down, you can see we get this graduated layer. What this means is the darker red areas will be affected more by any adjustments you make than the lighter areas, and obviously if there's no red, those areas will not be affected by the adjustments that you're about to make. So I'm happy with that gradient, and I'll return to my basics panel and I'll make a quick adjustment. Again, I'm going to slide my exposure down, and you can see at the top area of the image now is being affected, whereas the bottom area is being less affected, because our gradient primarily covered the top to middle part of our image. We'll drop that down and we'll desaturate, so you can see the effect it's having whilst leaving the bottom of our image. Okay, I hope that explains the overlay tools to you. I'll just press Ctrl and Z now to undo, and that's returned to our previous state. We'll now go to the crop tool, and the crop tool does what it says on the tin. It allows you to crop your image. And if we go to this drop down menu, you can see we've got unconstrained, which is already checked, and basically unconstrained allows you the freedom to crop wherever you see fit. You can drag the crop area, you can move the corners in, up, down, left, right, whatever suits your needs. And I'll just return this to the previous position. It's always useful to have this snapping tool selected. It just makes repositioning the crop selection a lot easier. And I'll show you the next selection, which is original ratio, and that basically retains the ratio you see on the screen. So if I drag this top corner in, you can see the ratio stays the same, whilst the size of the crop reduces or increases depending on where you drag your mouse. And then if we look at the next selection, we can see it's a custom ratio, and a custom ratio means you can just type in a ratio into here. So if I say 503 and I say 520 and press enter, my crop adjusts itself accordingly dependent on those custom ratios that I entered. So again, I'll return now to my original ratio, and we'll then look beneath the custom ratio. We have absolute dimensions, and absolute dimensions very similar to the custom ratio, but it differs in as much as you're actually defining the actual number of pixels along your edges. Beneath there we have our user selectable ratios with the common selections already made for you. We've got 1:1 for the perfect square, and 5:7, 10:8, 6:4. So hopefully that shows you how a crop tool works. I'm just going to go back to the 1:1 ratio, and I'm going to crop this in slightly now, and I'm going to try and center our flower in my selection, and I think that's a good starting point. So once you're happy with your selection, you simply press enter, and you can see now the image has been cropped for us. Okay, the next tool down is our white balance tool. If I click on that, the shortcut for that is W. You can see that our mouse pointer is turned into a crosshair. And what we can do, we can now click on an area of white in our image, just so that we can tell Affinity Photo which part of our image is white. So I'm just going to click on the end of this leaf here, and you can see that it's made a slight adjustment to my white balance. It's also ticked the white balance palette for us automatically, and you can now see the temperature and the tint sliders. Now, if you're not entirely happy with the adjustment that Affinity Photo has made, in this case what's happened is some of the green from the background is shining through this leaf, and that's had an adverse effect of applying a slight magenta tint. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go down to my tint slider, and I'm going to reduce that slightly. If I zoom out by pressing Ctrl and 0, I think the white balance is looking pretty good, although the image is looking a little bit underexposed, but we'll address that shortly. So I'm happy now with the crop of my image, and I can live with the blemishes that are still existing. And now going to try and look at the overall tonality and colour of this image. And to start, what I'd like to do is I'm going to set my black point. So if you look in the top right hand corner, you can see these three boxes. One is show clipped highlights, one is show clipped shadows, and one is show clipped tones. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to click on the highlight and shadows, and I'm going to go to my black point slider, and I'm going to slide it to the right. And you can see what's happening is darkening my blacks. And when I get to a certain point, this blue overlay appears. This is the show clip shadows tool, identifying where the shadows are clipping in my image. If I slide it back then to the left, you can see that they disappear and my shadows are no longer clipped. Now what I like to do is I like to slide this slider until the clipped blacks start appearing. You can see there with just a few areas of black clipping, and then I like to reduce that by about 3 to 4%, which gives me enough headroom then in my shadows to play with later on. We're now going to address the whites in our image. Now there are two sliders here that will affect our whites. One is the exposure slider and one is the brightness slider. Now the exposure slider mathematically affects every pixel in the image. So if I slide it to the right, all pixels will increase by a given value depending on where I am on the slider. And I'll double click this slider switch just to center the exposure meter back where it was. And the brightness slider works in a similar sort of way, with the exception that it has a bias towards the midtones of an image. So if I slide this to the right, you can see it's increased the brightness of the image, it's increased my whites, but it hasn't blown any of them. Now if I recenter that and I slide my exposure slider to the right, you can see that I soon get to a point where my whites are overexposed, as indicated by these red patches on the leaves. And this is the clipped highlight tool doing its job. So what I'll do then again is just I'll drop down my exposure until they disappear, and then I'll reduce it. And again, that gives me enough headroom to play with in the later stages of development. Now the exposure, black point and brightness sliders are good for a start point, but you can make further subtle changes now to the highlights and the shadows by selecting the shadows and highlight palette. And I'll just scroll down so that you can see the shadows and highlight sliders. Now again, I can make minor adjustments now to my shadows, and I'll slide it all the way to the left. Now if you refer back to our histogram, you can see by sliding this slider, the only area of my image that's getting affected is the shadow end of my histogram. And you can see from the image as well that only my shadows seem to be impacted by anything I do with this slider. So I can move it slightly to the left and drop my shadows, and I can see my show clip shadows indicator is still on and none of my shadows are clipping. And likewise, I can now move my highlight slider to the right or to the left to reduce or increase my highlights as I see fit. And now you can see, because we've increased the exposure slightly, we have less headroom to play with, and moving the slider extremely to the right completely blows out our highlights, which is what you'd expect, because a highlight slider tends to adjust this area of a histogram from the top end of our mid-range to our 100% white area, and pushing this slider to the right does push all of our whites into that 100% white, and 100% is our cut-off point with regards to editing photographs. So I'm going to drop that down ever so slightly till those little red indicators have disappeared, and I'm quite happy with that. Now, one thing that's interesting to point out in Affinity Photo is if you want to refer back to your starting point, you can see at the top here we've got three buttons. One single view, which is what we're on at the moment, one is split view, and one is mirror view. Now I won't go into mirror view today because that's a tutorial all in itself, but I will click on the split view, and you can see now we have a before and after slider, and if I take it to the left, that's how we started, that's what our image looked like when we started, but you can see it's also taken account of the crop, which makes things a lot easier. And if I slide that to the right, you can see now it shows us our edited image, so you can look back and see the improvements you've made, and you can return back to single view whenever you want. Okay, we're now going to move on to the lens palette, and you can see here the lens correction palette has been automatically checked, and that's because Affinity Photo applied a lens correction to our raw image on importing. And if I go up here to the assistant, you can see we have a few selections. The raw engine, which we have no choice over, has to be Serif Labs, and lens corrections. Apply lens corrections, and if I click on the drop down, take no action. Now, by having it applied, what it means is when it imports the raw image, Affinity Photo will apply a lens correction dependent on the EXIF information associated to that file. And then beneath there, then we have noise correction. Again, apply color correction or color reduction. And clicking the drop-down menu shows us we have a choice of apply color and luminance reduction, or just apply color reduction. I'll leave that checked as apply color reduction. And then beneath there we have raw output format, and again I've chosen 16-bit. The other alternative is RGB 32-bit, which is for high dynamic range images. And beneath there we have a tone curve, which is apply tone curve, or the alternative is take no action. Now what that does, it just applies a subtle S curve to our images, which just increases the contrast and makes the images more photographic from the outset. If you deselect that, basically what you'll end up with is a totally flat raw image. Some people prefer to use that as a starting point, whereas I prefer to have a subtle S-curve applied automatically by Affinity Photo. And then beneath that then we have a checkbox saying alert when assistant takes no action, and that does what it says on the tin. And again beneath that then we have the exposure bias drop down. If I click on that, you can see apply exposure bias as default and apply exposure bias as initial state. I wouldn't get too hung up on these. Basically what they mean is they'll look at the EXIF data for any exposure information attributed to that image, and they'll apply it accordingly. And the difference between the two, image-wise, is 0. But like I said, we're not going to get hung up too much on that, because that is a tutorial all in itself, and I'll probably look at that a little bit later on. So once we're happy, we've got our settings the way we want, we can just close that. As I said earlier, the lens correction checkbox has been automatically checked, and if you're not happy with what Affinity Photo has done with your lens profile adjustments, you can make subtle adjustments yourself using these sliders. But in our case, I think I'm quite happy with the job it's done. Right, moving down the palette, now we have the chromatic aberration reduction. Again, this is linked to the assistant manager and the profile that it's selected. So clicking on that will just make an automatic adjustment to any chromatic aberration the lens might have produced in our image. Okay, moving on, beneath the chromatic aberration reduction, once Affinity's done its job, we'll find the Defringe palette. And I'm just going to click on that now to turn it on. And if we scroll in on our image, because we've got an area of brightness here and an area of shade, that's where you'd expect to find fringing. And in fact, we can see here there's a subtle red strip going down the edge of our flower, and that's the fringing. Now, first of all, what we want to do, we want to tell Affinity what colour that fringing is. It was already on red, but I just move it now. You can see we've got a spectrum of colours. So I'm going to move it towards this one, because the red does look more orangey red rather than magenta red. And I'll just select that portion of my slider. I'm just going to check the also remove complementary hue, just in case there are any present. And now we can look at our radius tool, and our radius tool is basically telling the number of pixels that we want to affect with this adjustment. I normally find around 50-55% is a good starting point, and the tolerance slider is basically how much of that red fringing that we're willing to tolerate. And it sounds a bit backward, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it to 100% and say I don't want to tolerate any. If I move it down to 0, then I'm basically saying I'm willing to tolerate it all. So it sounds a little bit backward. And the threshold tool basically tells Affinity Photo where this effect is going to cut in. Now, if I left it at 100%, it wouldn't cut in at all. And if I left it at 0%, it'd probably be a little bit too dramatic. So I usually find about 3% threshold will do the job. Now, making sure that our split view is selected as opposed to our single view, we can now use our slider to see the before and after. So you can see the effect that the Defringe filter has had on our image, and I'm quite happy with that. I'm now going to click on the single view, and I'm going to press Ctrl and 0 to return to our image. So there you have it, a few little lens adjustments to correct our image. If I move down now to the palette below, which is remove lens vignette, I'm just going to check that, and we're presented with one slider, and basically this tells me how much vignette that Affinity Photo is going to remove from my image dependent on the lens profile that's been loaded. So if I decrease it, you can see the outside edges darken. If I increase it, you can see they brighten up. But in this instance, I think Affinity's initial starting point of 100% has done a pretty good job, so I'll return it to 100%. And we can then move on to the post-crop vignette tool. So if I just check that box and scroll down, you can see we've got 3 sliders here, one intensity, one scale, and one hardness. And what this is, basically introducing an artificial vignette into our photograph. This is totally separate from the vignette that might have occurred because of the lens. And to make adjustments here, we just use our sliders. So if I decrease the slider, the vignette gets darker. And if I increase it, the vignette gets lighter. So I'll decrease it. And we also have a scale control. But before I do that, I'm just going to go onto the hardness control. And I'm just going to increase that. And you can see here that the edge of our vignette is getting more defined. It's less soft. And if I take it all the way to the right, you can see it has a very artificial effect. I'm not entirely sure where you'd use that effect, but I'm sure somebody might come up with an idea. So what I'll do is I'll slightly decrease that, and we can see then with the scale slider then, we can just decrease or increase the size of that vignette, dependent on your needs. And if I bring up the hardness, you can see the effect it's had. So you can see how you can apply a vignette of your own choice or design, and I'll uncheck that then to say that I no longer require it. Okay, we can now move on to the details palette. And as you saw earlier in the Assistant Manager, we chose to have noise reduction applied. And if I zoom in on this area of shade in this top right corner, I'll turn off the noise reduction, and you can make out these little areas of green and magenta. That's the colour noise that's been introduced by the digital process within the camera, and it usually affects dark shaded areas such as this. And if I turn it back on again, you can see that they disappear. So Affinity Photo is doing quite a good job regards to reducing the colour noise. And if I go to this slider, I can actually reduce the amount of effect, because ideally what you want to do is you want to have as little noise reduction in your images as possible, because there are certain artifacts. So reducing this slider, you can see we still can't make out the green and magenta fringes. As I said earlier, I choose not to introduce any luminance noise reduction in my images because I do tend to shoot at low ISOs. However, I'll just show you for demonstration purposes. You can see in this area of shade, it looks what appears to be grain, and if I increase the luminance, the effect that has is it blurs that detail so that that graininess disappears. So if we did have an issue with regards to luminance noise, that's how it would get rid of that. So like I said, it's not such an issue with this photograph, so I'll return now to its normal state of 0, and I'll press Command or Control and 0 to zoom out. So I've now adjusted the noise, the colour noise in my image to my satisfaction, and we can now look at the next palette, which is Noise Addition. And again, this is a slider I very rarely use, but in some instances you might want to add noise to your image. Now an example of this would be perhaps where you'd created a vector image in a design program such as Affinity Designer, and you want that vector image to sit in with a photograph. Now obviously the photograph's going to have an element of noise, and it's been taken with a digital camera, and the vector image won't because it was created in a software package. So by moving this slider, you can introduce noise into your image. As such, obviously I can't see of an occasion where we need that amount of noise, so I'm just going to drop it slightly. And again, you can select whether or not that noise is Gaussian or colour. So I hope that explains that. And like I said, it's not something I use, so I'll just uncheck it. And the last palette within this details palette is the detail refinement. Now if I scroll in on this image, you can see how this affects the overall photograph. You can see there, the image is quite sharp, but it's not 100%. And basically the detail refinement tool allows me to increase the amount of sharpness in my image. The radius slider defines how many pixels that I affect with the detail refinement, and I normally find around 15 is a good starting point, And I'm just going to slide this slider now all the way to the right, just so that you can see the effect that the sharpness slider has on the image. And you can see that the sharpness has been refined quite extremely. And if I zoom out, if I turn it off, and then turn it back on again, you can see the effect it had is quite dramatic. Now, ordinarily, I wouldn't apply that much sharpening, so I'm just going to reduce that now to about 25%, and I'm quite happy with that amount of sharpening. Again, if I turn it off and back on, you can see it is subtle, but it has had a marked effect on my image. So I'm just going to press Ctrl and 0 now to zoom out. Okay, now we're going to move on to the Tones palette, and under this heading we have Curves, Black and White, and Split Toning. Now the Curves tool is very useful for adding subtle contrast changes to your image. As I explained earlier, we've applied a slight curve, S-curve, to our image already on importing, because we had it selected under our Assistant Manager. But if I wanted to add to that and just increase an overall contrast shift to my photograph, I can just do that by clicking on this line and adding nodes. Now you can add as many nodes as you like, and you can position them where you like. But if you want to go for a subtle sort of contrast lift, then you tend to go for a shallow sort of S-curve. But like I said, this is over-extenuated now because there's already been an S-curve applied to this image. So I'll just reset that by clicking on this little circular arrow. Another thing you can do now is you can selectively adjust contrast in different color ranges, and to do this you click on the master drop down, and we can click on the red, for instance, and now I can add a contrast curve, an S-curve, to my reds, and you can see the effect that's had on the overall image. It hasn't only affected this red ring in the center of the flower, it's boosted reds across the range. And again, I just drop that slightly and increase that, and it's had an interesting effect overall on our image, but again, it's not my desired effect today, so I'll just reset that and we'll uncheck the curves box. Now the black and white palette again is a little self-explanatory, and the black and white palette presents us with these various color sliders. Now, it might seem a bit odd to have colour sliders when you're referring to black and white, but basically black and white images are created from the existing colours in an image within Affinity Photo, and from that regard within cameras. So, for instance, I know this ring of the flower is red. If I wanted to darken that ring, I can simply slide down the red slider, and the effect that has is darkening the red ring. Obviously that's a little bit overkill, so I'll increase it slightly. And again, likewise, I know the background is predominantly green, and if I affect the green slider, I know I'm going to affect my background. So if I want to sort of bring more attention towards this flower, I could drop my green slider just to darken the background, and you can see the white of the flower now stands out that little bit more. And likewise, I know a lot of my highlights have a sort of yellowish edge to them, so if I click on my yellow slider and boost that to the right, I should see a marked impact on my highlights, and again that is way more than I'd normally want to apply. So I'll drop that down to about 129, and it's had a slight effect of boosting my highlights in my background, but that sort of goes against what I want to achieve by dropping the green, so I'll just return that to where it was. And I'm quite happy with those results regards to a black and white image, but I don't really want a black and white image today, so I can just reset that, and I can uncheck the black and white palette. Now we'll quickly move on to the split toning. I'm just going to check that, and split toning is quite clever, and it can be quite useful and have a dramatic effect on your images. Where it's useful is I can define a color scheme for my highlights and my shadows. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to under the highlight slider, I'm going to tell it I want my highlights to be orangey yellow, which is an old film trick, and likewise I want to make my shadows blue. Now the amount of color shift is defined by the saturation sliders, so I'm just going to slide these up to about 50%, and likewise for the shadows, roughly 50%, doesn't have to be accurate. And now I can use the balance tool to shift between having more preference towards my highlights or having more preference towards my shadows. So it has quite a dramatic effect on the photograph. I think it's quite an artistically pleasing effect, and have used it quite often, and I think in this instance it has added to the overall photograph. So once you're happy, you can now return to the basic palette, and you can make any slightly subtle changes to the image. Because we've lost a little bit of contrast here, what I'll do is I'll just add a little bit of contrast, 2%, and I'll look at my clarity slider. Now the clarity slider is very similar to the contrast slider. In fact, it's a mixture of the contrast slider and the sharpening tool, the detail tool that we looked at earlier, in as much it concentrates on perceived contrast, and it's more of a localized contrast tool. So if I zoom in here, you can see that these fine details are affected quite dramatically when I move the clarity slider. Now there is a downside to using clarity, because if you overkill it, as you can see here along the edge of the flower, we've introduced a halo, and that is the downside of using clarity. So you want to keep an eye on that when you're adjusting your images this way. So I'll just reduce that to maybe around 12%. It's usually a pretty good starting point. And again, you can see that the halo has reduced dramatically, and I'll just zoom out, and I can say I'm quite happy now with that image. And because of that, I'll now commit, and to commit to that development of our raw file, you simply click on the develop button in the top left hand corner, and our image is then taken into the photo persona for further editing. So that's the end of the tutorial today. Thanks very much for watching. Bye.